Hi there, in this tutorial I'm going to just show a few techniques that could be used to create some kind of Christmas card that you might want to distribute to your friends and family. Obviously this might be useful if you are unable to visit them at this time of year, given problems going on at the moment. So you can see we've got a message that appears and then there's a little Christmas pudding that drops down the back, and you can also see we've got some snow, some trees, and there's a little wobble on the camera as the Christmas pudding, which is obviously very heavy, lands on the ground. And we've got a snow texture on the ground as well. So to begin with, we'll create our landscape. So we'll just create a plane, we'll scale it up, and then we'll go into edit mode, right click and subdivide. We come down here, subdivide a couple more times, and then go into fractal and put that up, and you can see we start to get some actual landscape now. And we'll subdivide a little bit more. We're going to need quite a few vertices in certain places, but we don't want to go too mad. So we can do that, come out of edit mode and back in again, and then subdivide again with fractal on, and that will just give us some smaller bumps and lumps in the landscape. It's up to you how many you do. Come out of edit mode, right click and say shade smooth, but also I'm going to say Control 2 and add a subdivision surface. So that's just added a subdivision surface modifier at 2 levels. So you can see we've got our landscape. If we want to, we can scale on the Z just to increase the lumps and bumps a little bit. If I now turn my camera on, you can see where that is. And we can push this around and get something a bit more interesting. It's good to have different levels. So you want one at the front, one in the middle, one at the back. But also, because we want to see our message, we want a slope that's right in front of the camera, really. So this one here should do that. Now, because of the method I'm going to use, we're going to need more subdivisions in the landscape somewhere around here. I'm going to turn the display subdivisions down one because we're going to add quite a few vertices now. This isn't the only way to do it, of course, but this was one of the easiest ways. So we'll go to wireframe and we'll just select a bit of landscape just here. Come out of wireframe now, I think, and just have a look. So we don't need that back there actually. It's really just this slope in front of the camera that we want to work on right now. And then right click and say subdivide, but we don't want fractal on this time, so turn that off. And we'll go up a number of subdivisions. And what I did, just to make it a little more subtle, was actually come in one and then right click and say subdivide again. And I think I'll just smooth that a little bit there. Now you can get a little bit of blockiness appearing. The subdivision surface won't deal with it so well because of the way it's worked. So what you can do then is select it all and just say smooth vertices. And you might need to do that a couple of times, or you can turn it up here. And you can see that's doing the job. It's just to do with the way that subdivision works. So that's now got a much higher subdivisions area. We actually probably have not quite subdivided the right part of the landscape, but that's okay. We can select a few vertices here, press O to turn on proportional editing, GZ, and then just lift that up a bit. And that will let us see more the bit of the land that's got the subdivision on. And we'll just lower this stuff here down a bit, I think. And perhaps we'll go back here and raise some of these up. You can now see we've got a lot of subdivisions here. And I'll move the camera this way a little bit, I think. So our message is likely to appear somewhere around here. Probably going to need more subdivisions than that. So I'm just going to now select this area. Basically, the number of subdivisions you have for this method will set the fidelity, if you like, or resolution of the text that you're going to create. This is why we only do part of it, because otherwise we'd end up with an awful lot of vertices. That's quite a lot, and don't forget there's a subdivision surface on there as well. And again, we probably need to just smooth that a little bit. And there we go. So now it's a simple plane, albeit it's got lumps and bumps on it. So we'll go and select all the vertices and we'll say U unwrap. It'll say it's non-uniform, but we're probably going to rescale it anyway, so don't worry about that. And also, if I select some of this area here, I'm going to put a few trees on it. So I want to make sure that I don't have the trees right in front of the camera in the way of the text. So I'm just selecting this area here and add a vertex group, and we'll call it no trees and assign that. So now we'll add a simple material to it. And I'll open up my shader editor and we'll call this snow ground. I'm going to add texture, which is an image texture. And I have a tileable snow texture. You can find snow textures on places like CG Textures. I took one of those and I made it tileable by just mirroring it, placing it next to itself and then mirroring it again. It's a crude way of doing it, but it does the job, and you can do that in Nodes if you prefer. I'm going to do this, of course, in Eevee, and you can see it's quite large, relatively speaking, at the moment. So if I open the UV editor and call up the snow image and then go into edit mode and select my mesh, you can see it's only the same size as the tile at the moment. So I'm now going to make it quite a bit bigger, which will make the texture a lot smaller. And it's fairly tileable, so that's not too much of a problem. If it wasn't tileable, you'd of course get lines and things, and I've shown on some other tutorials how you can reduce that problem. So just to make it a bit more interesting, before we go any further though, I'll add a sun lamp. We'll stick that over here for the moment, just so that we can get some shading in the scene. Give it a very slight yellowy cast, and I had mine set to a strength of 4. We go to rendered view now, we can see that. And for the sky, we'll say use nodes, and we'll change this up here to world, and under color we'll change that to the sky texture. Now they don't work quite as well as they do in cycles. I used Pritham, which is a bit simpler, and that one seemed to work the best. You can see we're getting a bit of a sky material there, and I'll just move that off to this side where the sun's coming from. I had a turbidity of about 2.1. I set my background strength to about 0.2, so relatively dark. You can see that's a bit better. And then just to tweak it a bit, I added a hue saturation node. I put the factor at about 0.87, and I put the saturation at about 1.2, just to sort of increase the colours. You can see we've got a slight sort of pinky colour fading to blue as it goes up. So back to my materials, just alter the angle of that sun a little bit just to give us a bit more shadow there, and change this back to object. So we need to do a little bit more with the snow. It's a bit smooth at the moment. So first of all, we'll add converter, which is a color ramp. I set it to ease and turn the points up to somewhere around here for this particular material. I'm looking to get these little dots. Then I add another node from vector, which is the bump map. Take the output from the color ramp into the height of the bump map. I had mine set to a strength of about 0.15, and that goes into the normal map. I'll be providing this file to all of my Patreon subscribers, so you won't have to go through this, but it's fairly straightforward. I also added from the color section an invert node. Take that into the color input. I set it down slightly to about 0.87, so that sort of backs off from complete inversion. If I show you what that looks like, obviously it'll take a second, but it's the other way around. You can see these little dark spots. And I put that into roughness. So this basically is giving us little points where it's shinier, and you can see that's showing there. And put the material back in there from here. So it gives us these little shiny high spots. Just to make sure, I then added an input which is a texture coordinate. Take UV into there. Shouldn't make really any difference. And I added the texture, which is a noise texture. I'll put that over here, but I will connect the UV into the vector input on the noise texture, connect the factor into displacement on the material output, and add a converter, which is a math node, into there. Set it to multiply, and I had it at about 0.05. Set the roughness of the noise texture to 1, and then I had a scale of about 125. Now that will need to be tweaked because it all depends on exactly how big the landscape is that you create. So we'll go a little higher, and I think I'll even go smaller on that. Go for 0.01 on the multiply, maybe even 0.005 for this particular one. So it's just to add a little bit of more random noise to the scene. I'm turning the scale down a little bit there. I'm going down perhaps to somewhere like 100. We'll go with 100 for the scale. And now I can perhaps set the value to 0.009. There we go. So that's our basic snow done. You can obviously tweak some of the effects as you go along, but that's the basis of our snow field. You can see it becomes a little bit shinier and more reflective if we go this way with the invert. And obviously you can alter which parts of it are more lumpy and bumpy and with shiny speckles here. So now we need to do some text. So I'm going to put my 3D cursor over here and then add text. So we can just type some text now. Best tab to go into edit mode there. Come out of edit mode, and if we click on this little A here, we can change things like the font. So we can click here, and it will give you a preview of the fonts once it updates. Unless you have an awful lot of vertices on your ground plane, don't go to too complicated a font or it'll be difficult to read. And if you have to have an awful lot of vertices, that'll make it take a lot longer to render and so on. So go with a fairly simple one, I suggest. So you'll need to set the size. Obviously you can change that at any time. And come down here, and I set both of these to center, and you can even play with the line spacing if you want to. Under geometry, we actually want it to extrude, so we'll take it out that way, something like that. It needs to be tall enough that all of the text will impinge with the ground at some point. So if I bring it over here, we'll look through the camera. It's actually too big at the moment, so I'm going to take that down. So I said RXX there to rotate on its own x-axis. So can I see all of the text on both sides of the mesh? Yes, I can. And I've tilted it, so that should create an impression in the landscape that makes sense, as it were. And I'll just check that we're in the right place. So let's just move the ground over a little bit. And we're probably going to have a couple of problems. So I'm just going to make it slightly smaller. Obviously, I'm doing this more quickly than I did the first time around. So that works, and you could use that like that. But I decided to make it look as though something had fallen into the snow. So let's come out of rendered view, and I'll turn on cavity, which just helps you to be able to see the shape of objects. So I'm going to duplicate that text and just move some vertically outside of the view of the camera, because I'm going to use that again later. Now this text I'm going to animate at this point. Let's go with the 250 frames for the seam. I'm going to move it on its z-axis, so you can see it's tilted. So I'm going to say G, Z, Z, and you can see it comes up at the angle of the text. And I'm going to just take it up so it's not touching the ground at all. It doesn't have to be out of view. And I'm going to press I and store the location. I'm going to come up to say frame 50 and press I and store the location again. So it's going to do nothing. And then over the course of perhaps 5 frames, up to frame 55, G, Z, Z, and we'll bring it down so that it impinges with the ground. And make sure that it's all gone through the ground. It has. So I, location again. And then right click one of these yellow keyframe dots and go up to interpolation mode and just set it to linear. So let's have a look at how quickly that happens. Might even need to be a little quicker, but we can change that later. We're not actually going to see this particular version of the text, but to do what we need to do, we now need this text to be a mesh rather than a curve, which is what text is normally. So if we press F3 and start typing convert, we can just say object convert to mesh. We can now see that this is a mesh object. I don't need to do anything more to that other than make it invisible when we render. And to help me see what's going on with the ground, I'm going to click here, Object Properties. Under Visibility, I'm going to turn it off in the render, and under Viewport Display, I'm going to turn off Shadow, and we'll say Display as Bounding Box. So all we can see now is that there's a little box there, and then at some point that box moves slightly. So that's good. So we'll go back to the ground now, and we'll go to the physics properties, and we'll click dynamic paint. We'll say add canvas, because this is the canvas on which we want to draw. Click anti-alias, so that just gives you smoother edges. And we know that this object finishes hitting the ground before frame 60. So we'll only say frame start 1 and end frame 60. Don't forget you would need to change that if you need this to extend further. We don't want this to be too long because this is going to have to create a cache file. So under surface, we'll change that to displace. We don't need to set anything for brush collection, and we don't need dissolve. And then we can open up the cache and we're ready to bake. But before we do that, we need to create a brush. So we've got a canvas. So I've selected our text bounding box, and we'll say dynamic paint, and we'll change this to brush now, and we'll say add brush. All of this can be left at default, and if it doesn't already say it, make sure it's saying mesh volume, and that just helps avoid any problems. And if we select the ground, we can now press play, and you can see there it goes. We've now created an impression in the snow that is our text. Now at the moment, don't forget that's subdivision surface is only displaying at 1. If I go up to 2, it will actually add more detail, but you can see it's taking longer to go now, and we're only rendering at 6 frames a second. And as you go up and up on the number of vertices, that will obviously be more of a problem. But it's a pretty good result there, as you can see. So I'm going to go back down to the lower resolution there. So we've created our text. We can have a look at what that looks like. So it looks like something's fallen in the snow. So we know that this falls into the snow about there, about frame 55, which is roughly where the block moves. So let's select our text up here. Let's just give it a new material. And all I did with this was make it slightly shiny and give it a fairly dark sort of brown, almost like wood colour, but you barely see it, so it's really just to have something there. I wanted it far enough away that it didn't cast shadows. So let's go back to say frame 45, store the location of this object, and then come up to frame say 57, a few frames beyond where the text forms, and GZ, take that down to just below the plane and store the location. Now what we will probably need to do in a moment is tweak these keyframes and let's just check that they are linear interpolation, just to get the falling object coincident with the text appearing. Now we could use that falling object as a thing which creates this text, but what you will need to do is to have a lot more subframes. So if I show you in here, let's anti-alias that, I thought I did that. In here you can see we've got subframes or substeps. So this is looking between frames in order to take account of objects which are moving so fast that they might be on one side of the mesh in one frame and already be on the other in the next frame. So fast moving objects could shoot through the mesh without actually causing any effect. So you render substeps. But all that really means is for if you do one substep, then for each transition of one frame to the next, instead of rendering 2 frames, you actually render 3. So a more efficient way of doing it is to have a more slowly moving object which creates the deflection, and a faster moving object which is just what appears to have created the deflection. But you can do it that way if you want to. You'll just find that you probably need to turn up substeps, unless it's something that just floats to the ground more slowly. If we go back now, we're not actually at 25 frames a second, so this is more slow than it would be in reality. We can try, that doesn't look too bad actually. We can try under playback, say frame dropping. What that will do is it will skip frames to try to achieve the 25 frames per second, which is the default. It's still not making it though, because it's got a lot to do. I think that's not bad, even taking account of the fact that that text is falling a little slowly. If we go slowly now, probably going to appear just before the text gets, yes, so you can see the text is starting to appear just before that gets there. So we can advance that by press G there and just bring that back. So that's effectively getting it to fall more slowly, and you can see it just about there now. If I now use the arrow keys, you can see that seems to work quite well now. So let's just let that fall, and that's looking pretty good now. So that's our text. Let's just quickly create a Christmas pudding. We'll say shade smooth. I'm not going to go into as much detail on this one as I did on the other, but we'll very quickly create the material. I put quite a lot of nodes on this Christmas pudding just to try and get the sort of effect of it. So to begin with, we'll add a noise texture. I'll start with the values I used, so that's a scale of 20 and everything else at default. Then add converter, which is a color ramp. Factor adder there into the color ramp, left it at linear, and turn these points, these sliders, somewhere around the middle with a little bit of a gap between them. Then add color mix node. Take the color output of that into one side, set it to darken. Then I'm going to move all of these to the left. I'm then going to duplicate these two and duplicate them again. I'm going to set the scale for the next one to 15. I moved the points out slightly on that one, and I need another darken node. This node feeds into that one, and that feeds into that one. So we're adding up these two slightly different textures. So if I show you what these are looking like at the moment, roughly, so you can see that's the output of one of them. The other one will be similar but not identical. You can see it's slightly different, and then the two are combined by that one. So I'm obviously going to combine the third one with this node. This one I set a scale of 36, and I put the white end quite a long way up and the color input to there. So we've got this complicated pattern now. So I'm going to duplicate this one and put it there and change this to a mix node. I'm going to have a fairly dark brown on one side and a slightly redder, lighter brown on the other, and feed the output of this one into the factor on that one. And then put a color mix node here, and I'm going to take the output from here into the mix factor. I'm going to set this lower end to a fairly light brownish sort of color, somewhere around there. And then I'm going to take this output and put it into the first color. So it needs some tweaking, but we're starting to get there. I'm now going to add under vector a bump node and take the output of this node into the height and set the strength to about 0.3. And that of course goes into the normal input on the shader. And then finally, as usual, another noise texture plugged into displacement with converter, which is a math node, set to multiply. I used a value of 0.02 and a scale of 140. And then we can tweak the colors and things. We want to make our Christmas pudding a little darker. But there it is. I'm not going to go into the detail of creating the leaf and the berries at the moment, but essentially that's a similar sort of process. So there's our Christmas pudding, probably too big at the moment, so we'll make it a little smaller. And we want shortly after our text has landed. So our text lands at about frame 60. So perhaps at frame 75, that's when our Christmas pudding will land. So put it something like that. Press I and store location. We now go back. We want it to be moving quite quickly, so perhaps just to frame 65. and take it up well away so it doesn't put shadows here. And if it does, you can turn shadows off and store the location there. So if we now have a look at how that's looking, the text lands and then the Christmas pudding comes after. And if we want to move it, we can just drag those points to the right. And if we want it to fall more quickly, we can make them closer together. Bearing in mind this is running more slowly than it really would be at the moment. So I'm going to reduce the length of my animation now just to make things quicker to about 150 frames. So that's got those objects falling, and now we just need to do a few little tweaks such as adding some snow and some trees and things like that. So let's just add under curves the sapling. It always puts it in the middle. I loaded the preset, which was the Douglas fir. Select it and move it off to the side. It doesn't need to be that big, and then do it again. So we'll add under sapling, again Douglas fir, but this time we'll change the seed just to give us a slightly different distribution so it doesn't look like an identical tree. And I'll just do 3, but you can do more than that. And then we need a material for them. So we'll say new, we'll add texture, which is an image texture, and then you just need to find a bark texture. I wanted one that had a fair bit of white on it, so these are just some photos I took of tree bark. They're not really tileable, but it doesn't matter too much for this application. And I'll use this one. And we'll put that initially into there. I also zoom in on our tree so you can see that's passable bark. We'll also add another image texture. This time we'll select our snow for the image on that one. I'll add a color mix node. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to add a gamma node for the bark just to darken the bark a little bit so it's more noticeable. And I'm going to add the usual, most commonly used node of all the texture nodes, I would say, is the noise texture. I set it to about a scale of 10, but we may need to play with that. I put the detail up, and of course the next most commonly used node, the color ramp, if not more common. Left it on linear, put the black slider about the middle and the right slider just down from the top a little bit, and then use that to control the factor. So the idea is that it will just give us areas where there's lighter color, where there might be frost or snow, and areas where it's more bark. You can see as I play with the scale how that affects the tree. We're not going to see these trees in detail, but it just gives you some variation on there. We obviously could play around and add detail by adding bump in there, whether that's out of the bark texture or whatever, but it's not really worth it because these aren't things we're going to see close up. So select the other 2 trees and then select the one to which we've added a material. Come over to here under the material and say copy to selected. So they've all got that material now. Press M and say new collection, and we'll call that trees. While I'm here, I need to make some snow particles. Now you could just do this with just little objects, little meshes, or you can do something a little more fun, which is to actually create your own snowflakes. So we'll say add under image, images as planes, and I have these. So we'll just say import images as planes, and there they are. Now it's not quite as I want them to start with, but we can fix that easily enough. So these images don't actually have an alpha on them, but they are just simple black and white images of snowflakes, so they're easy enough to use. So rather than using the alpha output, and there isn't an alpha, if it's an image with an alpha channel, then you can use it like that. But if not, then just take the color output into alpha, and you can see we've now got something that looks as you'd expect it to look. So we'll just do that for each of them. And I wanted different snowflakes rather than them all look the same. And the other thing I did, because I felt the snowflakes weren't bright enough, is add a little bit of emission. So you can have it full white or just some way off that. And it's just basically putting an emission color. And you can of course play with the strength of the emission as well here. It doesn't matter that the whole thing is being set to an emission color because it's got this effective alpha mask on it. So we've now got our snowflakes. Select each of them. Press M. New collection. Snowflakes. We're now ready to create a new plane. Scale it up. Put it over the landscape and lift it up and make sure it's reasonably large. Don't worry about the shadow at the moment. Snow emit is what I've called it, and we'll come to here under particle properties and we'll create a particle system. I created about 6,000 particles and I started at -300. Now the exact number will vary depending on how high it is and so on, but we'll start with that. So in other words, it will already be emitting particles when the animation starts. And it's going up to 200 at the moment, so I can just set that back to 150 as that's the length of my animation. The lifetime of the particles will need to be long enough that they can make it through the ground. So I'll set this to 500 at the moment and we'll see what happens. So you can see there they are. They're probably falling at something approximating the real rate that they would fall at, but actually it doesn't look as good. So they're just blobs at the moment, of course. So under velocity, I had a little bit of randomize and I put 0.12 there. So they're not all falling at exactly the same speed. Turn on rotation. I put phase up at maximum, which is 1, and randomize phase at 2, so that affects the rotations of them. And I turned on dynamic rotation, which allows you then to change the angular velocity. So this is how much they're spinning as they fall, and I set that to 1.5. Under physics, I actually did change this, but we'll leave it where it is for the moment. Brownian, which is the sort of wobble that happens on them, it's a Brownian motion you'd see under a microscope when looking at pollen grains, for example, which you probably did in school. But for our purposes, it's just how the flakes flicker left and right and so on as they fall. Slightly more realistic effect. So I set that to 0.8. You don't want too much of it. I set drag to 0.45 just to help slow the particles down a little bit. Then under render, not halo, we want collection. We don't want to show the emitter when it's rendering. And then the instance collection is of course our snowflakes. Make sure it's pick random and we can click object orientation, but it doesn't really matter too much. Then come down to field weights and I set gravity to a very low value, 0.05. I wanted them to fall quite slowly. So let's see what that's looking like now. They're still falling fairly quickly, so let's try a mass of 0.5 and we'll say multiply mass with size. And I should have set the scale under render as well. So we'll set the randomness up to 0.8, so that gives us a variation in the size of them, and we'll go up a bit on the size of our snowflakes and see what that looks like. That's looking better. So if we want them to be a bit slower, we can turn drag up a little bit, and we can even turn gravity down. You see that's possibly a bit too little gravity there. But you can play around with all of these effects, get the sort of snowfall that you want. If I turn this off, we can see the snow a little better. And there we go. I just turned frame dropping off again because it's making it look like everything was going faster than it really was. So there's our snow coming down. And then finally, there's two last effects that I wanted to do, which was a little puff of snowflakes we'll just do it for the text as the text hits. So that will be approximately there. So about frame 55, we want a puff of snow coming up as that hits the ground. And we want the camera to wobble a little bit when the Christmas pudding hits the ground. We'll just take a copy of this plane and shrink it down initially and put that somewhere around here. Scaled down and just underneath the text. It doesn't matter too much, we're not going to see the plane itself. So I now need to change the particle system. Before you change anything, make sure you click this little 2 here, otherwise you'll be affecting your main particle system. Need only a few snow particles for this, so I set that to 200. Start frame needs to be where we want the collision to happen, so about 55, and just 3 or 4 frames beyond that, so say frame 58 is when they end, and the lifetime can be perhaps just 100 frames. It doesn't need to be that long. So if we start playing there, you can see we'll get to frame 55 and then a number of particles come out. So I set the normal velocity up to about 3 just to help them go in the direction I wanted them to go. And you can see I just need to rotate that, so rotate XX 180. You can see they fired up possibly a bit too quickly. Yeah, so let's drop that a bit because we've also got still the very low gravity on this. So I've reduced that to 1 and I'm going to turn the gravity up because I guess these are slightly heavier, maybe slightly melted snow particles. There we go. And you can see we possibly need to adjust when they're emitted because they come out too late. It's obviously slightly below the surface and we can raise it up a bit, which will make them visible sooner. So let's just see what that looks like. That's closer, but you can see we just need to get them emitting slightly earlier. So let's go for 53 to 55 as our start and end frames. That's pretty close now. Maybe slightly earlier. And even earlier than that. So that will do that. So you can see there we have our snow particles emitted just as the object appears to fall through the ground. Could possibly even be slightly earlier than that. And then the final thing is around frame 82, which is roughly where Christmas pudding stops moving. We want a little jiggle on the camera. So we'll go to frame 81 and we'll store the rotation of the camera. We'll go then to frame 83 and we'll rotate XX the camera slightly. We could rotate on other axes as well, of course, and store that rotation. If we go to the dope sheet up here, just minimize some of these so it's not so complicated. but the camera is the one we're interested in. So that's where the camera started. If we go to there, and then it rotates down slightly there. If we want it to go back to there, we can just Shift D and duplicate those and just bring them on to a few frames later. So now at the moment the camera is just going to do a little single bump. But what we can do is we can change the interpolation mode of that keyframe to bounce. We go here and we select interpolation mode, bounce. That'll just give us a slightly different curve to it. It sort of goes further than we actually rotated it and then comes back a little bit. And you can try other ones as well. So there is an elastic one, which is probably not what we want. Yeah, you can see we get some slightly... Actually, that's not too bad. When you think this is only running at a slower frame rate. The last thing I forgot to do was just to add our tree particle system. So I've selected the ground, create a new particle system. I had about 50 trees. Make sure it's set to hair. Click Advanced. Under Source, Distribution Random, use modifier stacked. Generally a good idea, but can cause you a few problems with the subsurf modifiers, but it should be okay. I turned off even distribution because it doesn't look as random as it otherwise would. Turn on rotation and say global Z, so they're all vertical, or will be eventually. But then add a tiny amount of variation on that, so I set 0.01 to randomize just the angle of the trees a little bit. Turn phase up and turn randomize phase fully up as well. Physics we don't need to change. Under render, we'll select collection and we'll select our trees collection. Now you can see, as always, they're all lying down at the moment. We'll say object rotation and pick random. Then we'll select our 3 tree objects here. Press R, Y, 90. Now if we come back to here, you can see they're all visible now. The reason they've all tended to cluster around here is because there's a lot more vertices here. Let's carry on. We obviously want to play with the scale of them a bit, so let's go for 0.01. That's a bit too small. 0.025, it's probably closer. And we want a fair bit of randomness on the scale as well. Not too much, but a reasonable amount. We don't need to change field weights, but under vertex groups, we can now select our no trees group and then click this little thing here to invert it. And now you can see we don't have any trees where we want our text to appear. And I think we can make these trees a little larger now. And we can go back up to the top and play around with the seed to try different distributions. It's always nice to have some shadows across the scene. And obviously the trees theoretically should have needles on them, but I think this is fine as a simple representation. And maybe we don't even need this many, we'll go for 25 perhaps. So just playing that once more, one of the great things about Eevee is that we can almost play in real time, depending on what we've got in the scene. Here comes our text. There's the little snow particles being pushed out by it. And then we've got our Christmas pudding landing. Now, obviously, we've got a tree in the way there, so what we could do, just play with the seed, or we could even define an area there that the trees won't be seen. So as I said, I will provide the file for the final version of this to my patrons, but it's a fairly straightforward thing to create anyway. If I don't have another tutorial before Christmas, have a great Christmas and New Year or holiday. If you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to click like and subscribe. You'll find a link to Patreon, my Twitter account and my Facebook page below, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.